Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Adam Goodman, partner at Ballard Partners.
Great to be with you after another night of entertainment.
Another night of entertainment. The fourth GOP presidential debate was on Wednesday night. Let's get started. What were your takeaways?
Well, yeah, certainly I think there was no breakaway moment for anybody. I think on balance, the former ambassador Nikki Haley did well. I think actually Christie did very well. Not that he has a chance necessarily to seriously compete for the Republican nomination, but he was the adult in the room and showed the kind of thing we've seen in past debates. And of course, he's a veteran of debates, where he kind of reins everybody in and says, look, boys and girls, let's put it where it really is. His defense at one point of Nikki Haley, I think, was telling the governor of Florida did pretty much as expected, which is not necessarily good news for him as he needs to show momentum going into Iowa. And Vivek does what he always does, which is he gets everybody's hair, on fire at different points about different things. And even though the former president, Brittany, was not on stage, Vivek, in a sense, is serving as, you might say, the de facto attack dog for the former president, as if he were on the ticket running as his vice presidential running mate.
I want to talk about him specifically, and you and I talk about him every time we do one of these recaps. He doesn't come across as likable, which he was questioned about, or about like sowing division on the stage within the party. But something that he said, I want to get your opinion on if this punch landed. He said something to the effect to Nikki Haley, I bet you can't even name 3 regions in eastern Ukraine. She eventually did, but she did kind of have what looked like a stunned look on her face, which he called out. Do you think the damage was done that she waited a few minutes to answer the question?
Well, you might say she might have almost stumbled into a Rick Perry moment when he was trying to name 3 things that he was prioritizing on the economy and came up with 1.5. It also reminds me, by the way, Brittany, of something that happened years ago when in a U.S. Senate race between Jerry Brown and Pete Wilson, where Jerry Brown thought he was going to trap Pete Wilson in showing ignorance of foreign policy, talked about some inane UN resolution having to do with Namibia. And damn it, Pete Wilson didn't have the answer. I mean, and even his own handlers were shocked. Did it do any damage to Nikki? No, because if this were truly an evaluation on who has the best foreign policy chops, it's very obvious that Nikki Haley wins that one hands down. What was more in play was how does she handle criticism, right? And clearly she was the center of attack in much of that debate. And I think generally she handled it very well. Vivek is an unguided missile. I think Christie said he's like a drunk driver on a debate stage. I thought it was one of the best lines of the debate, by the way. And he really is. And the effect he's trying to have is as a disruptor, is to disrupt the normal flow of things. And the other thing, Brittany, is in a way you're seeing profiled on stage this schism in the Republican Party between MAGA and the establishment, and MAGA being represented more, I think, by Nikki Haley and Christie, and MAGA more certainly by Vivek, and to some extent Ron DeSantis. So, and that's a debate that is ongoing well beyond presidential television debate stages today.
You did mention how the dynamics did shift this debate, because going into the first debate, Governor Ron DeSantis was the front runner of that pack, obviously, sans Donald Trump. Now it seems like a different story because Governor DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy were immediately going after Nikki Haley to the point where she said they're just jealous. What do you think of this dynamic shift?
Well, it's a dynamic shift reflected in the reality of polling, whether you believe in polls or not. The funny thing, Brittany, is people in politics tend to believe a lot in polls when it shows them doing well. And when they're not doing as well, they discount them. I think Governor DeSantis, early on in the debate, tried to discount any of the polls that are showing him starting to flag in relation to Nikki Haley and the others. But I think the dynamic here in the die is set. And can we talk just for a second about what's ahead? You've got Iowa, where everyone says, oh my God, it's a make or break state. It could be for Governor DeSantis, because if he doesn't rise to expectations in Iowa, right now he's polling fourth in New Hampshire. I don't care what poll you're looking at, he's not doing well there. Doesn't figure to do well in South Carolina, which is shortly after that. He's got to do well there. He has a decision to make about whether or not he continues in this race, actually, after Iowa. Given he's still governor of the state of Florida, he can go back home and say, I have unfinished business. But Iowa has a very spotty track record in terms of predicting Republican winners in the primary. Their last three competitive ones, you have to discount 20, which is kind of a walkover for Donald Trump. In 12, 16, and 2016, 12, and 8, those three. The three winners in Iowa, good trivia quiz, were Huckabee, who of course went on to ignominy, right? Rick Santorum and Ted Cruz. Huckabee, Santorum, Cruz, good guys. None of them really went anywhere in the presidential race. So you really get to New Hampshire. New Hampshire has nearly 40% of the electorate registered as unaffiliated, independents. And independents can vote in either primary by law in New Hampshire. The first real test, Brittany, is New Hampshire. But I'm not sure that Governor DeSantis survives till then, because if he does poorly in Iowa versus expectations and in New Hampshire, that certainly goes ill, not just for his presidential prospects, but his ability to come back to Florida and have a position of political strength to govern. Christie actually has a shot to overwhelm people with expectations in New Hampshire because of that independent factor. Even Democrats, by the way, election day registration, Democrats can on election day change their registration. I don't think many will, frankly, because a lot of Democrats don't ever want to think they were once registered as Republican. But it's kind of an open derby. And I think in terms of Vivek Ramaswamy, when you get past his causticness and restlessness and all that stuff, I think he's auditioning for the future, not for the present.
You bring up a really interesting point over the next 6 weeks, and obviously Trump is far and away the front runner. These four are really vying for number 2. So who do you think the stakes are highest for then? Who has the most to lose? Do you think it's DeSantis?
I think Ron DeSantis has the most to lose if he does poorly in Iowa, limps into New Hampshire, does poorly in New Hampshire. I think he has the most to lose because, again, he's still the elected governor of the state of Florida with a lot of track ahead of him to do things in one of the most important melting pots in politics in America. Christie has nothing to lose. It's like all in. And I think Vivek Ramaswamy has already won because these people can somewhat pronounce his name and understand where he's coming from. It's Nikki Haley. Now, she has a decision to make, Brittany, and it's an interesting one. Let's hypothetically say she does decently in Iowa, maybe even more than decently, does really well in New Hampshire, even without winning. She goes into South Carolina. She's second in South Carolina. Does she go all in with a lot of money now already starting to come behind her? Does she go all in, meaning will she do anything it takes to try to win the nomination? And the reason I say that is she has another option, ultimately, and so does the former president, if he's the presidential nominee, and that's Nikki Haley on the ticket. Not as number 1, but as number 2, with Donald Trump, who, if he were to succeed with Nikki Haley, is a lame duck president on day 1. So she would be arguably potentially one of the most powerful vice presidents in the history of the country. So does she go all in? I think she's holding those cards close to the vest, so to speak. Don't know where that goes yet. I think she wants to see how this plays out. Clearly, she's got momentum. Clearly, she's got more and more money, Brittany, coming behind her, which allows her to do things she wasn't able to do even 4 to 6 weeks ago in terms of ground operation, in terms of television advertising. But still, the big boy, Donald Trump, is still where he began. And if you look in South Carolina, he's up 20 points in South Carolina. He's up about 25 points in New Hampshire. Even if you start collapsing the contenders, he's still going to be everything the contenders can handle in terms of actually defeating him in a primary contest.
Let's talk about the big boy, as you described, and that is Donald Trump. The Vivek Ramaswamy, Nikki Haley, and Governor Ron DeSantis, they were more tepid in their criticisms of the former president. Governor Christie went all in. He called him Voldemort, amongst other things. He also said that his colleagues on stage were, quote, afraid to offend Donald Trump. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's so patently obvious. Everyone's walking on eggshells, other than Chris. Chris, his reputation, even if you take away the 3 years that he was somewhat wildly supportive of Donald Trump, his reputation is for kind of telling it like it is, whether you like it or not. And I think people find that kind of reality, whether they buy it or not, they feel that kind of approach is attractive, right? So I think it's obvious why he went that way. The other three are thinking, how can I possibly go full bore at the former president without collateral damage? Because a big part of the base that may be with Trump right now, it could very easily be persuaded as a fallback to go with Nikki or to go with Ron DeSantis, are nervous about more directly and savagely going at the former president. Nikki Haley, I thought took another step in that direction when she said, look, in terms of China, agree with the trade policies that Donald Trump forged in terms of China, but everything else, no. She went after fentanyl in particular and other things she thinks he actually failed on. So she took another step without necessarily going all in against Trump, but anyone trying to do that does that at their own peril.
So overall, let's talk about News Nation in general, Donald Trump, even though he wasn't on stage yet again, and the contenders there. Who do you think were the ultimate debate winners and losers?
Well, one of the debate winners was News Nation. I thought they did a very good job. The moderators did a tremendous job of controlling the debate. There was a little bit of rambunctiousness, we'll call it, at times, but I think the questions were good. They were also somewhat different than what we had heard in previous debates, so kudos to them. I think Nikki Haley, clearly because she was being attacked 2/3 of the night, established that she's now among the contenders to Trump, the one to beat. So I think she comes out a winner. And again, I thought Christie, in a big way, really showed the kind of maverick independence that a lot of Americans, I think, kind of applaud. Whether they're with him or not politically, they like that in political leaders, and we see very little of that today.
We saw the herd really thin out from the last debates to now. There was only 4 people on the stage. Going into Iowa, we're less than 6 weeks away here. Do you think anyone else should drop out? Or do you think, if you made it this far, you might as well go to Iowa?
I love this question about dropping out. You tell that to Ron DeSantis, who spent like a year and over $100 million already in trying to secure the nomination, to Nikki Haley, who's probably been thinking about this ever since she stepped into office as governor in South Carolina, to Vivek Ramaswamy, who come from nowhere, suddenly has this experience where people are listening to him on the presidential debate stage. In a perfect world, for those who would like to deny Donald Trump the nomination, they would all drop today in favor of Nikki Haley. He would be the obvious kind of congealing force. But short of that, unlikely as it is, we have. I think the die is cast here. I think we're looking at an inexorable march to the nomination by Donald Trump. Unfortunately for the contenders, the big court cases against the former president don't really begin in earnest until March. Everyone say, "Oh my gosh, when that happens, he could be in real trouble." Well, it's going to take a while for those court cases to begin and end, for those court cases to be resolved, and then of course there'll be appeals. So say the former president is accused and indicted on all fronts, in all court cases. And then you'll have the appeals that will go well beyond the presidential election. So I think it's wishful thinking that we are seeing anything other than a Trump inexorable march. The question is, with someone on that debate stage, in particular Nikki Haley, would she consider taking number 2, knowing that she would serve a lame duck president and be well positioned from day one in that administration to take over?
You brought up an interesting point earlier in that there's this schism in the Republican Party between establishment Republicans like Nikki Haley and MAGA Republicans like Donald Trump. So when you think about the future of the Republican Party, is it short-term MAGA and then long-term perhaps establishment if Nikki Haley was that VP position?
Well, that's a great question. There's been a struggle, a fight internally within the Republican Party. You see that in Congress with the Freedom Caucus. The Tea Party movement was another part of that. There's always going to be disagreement within the parties themselves. You can say that about Democrats. Liberal progressives versus more centrist, moderate Democrats. There's always going to be a debate and discussion. But something else that happened last night was interesting. Ron DeSantis went after Nikki Haley as kind of the tool of big donors and big dollars and corporate interests. That is telling because the Republican Party, and DeSantis actually has been pretty good at this, as some of the others have been as well. Republican Party are trying to become the party of the working class all over again, of working Americans versus the party of big corporations. And I think DeSantis is trying to force Nikki Haley and others into the corner of big corporations, which today are becoming more and more unpopular in the American political conversation, regardless of the monies that they can bring to bear. We've certainly seen that chapter and verse with Republicans having to do with Disney, Coca-Cola, and others.
Do you think Ron DeSantis is really successful at doing that, at putting Nikki Haley in that corner?
Well, I think he tried to do that, and he's trying to do that. Unfortunately, just my 2 cents, Ron DeSantis had the greatest story going into this field. Short of the former president, he had the Florida story. All sorts of incredible achievements he had brought as a leader, as a gutty leader, as someone against the grain. And he very early on kind of threw that overboard, I believe, in favor of being the ultimate culture war warrior. And I think when he went that way, he became less appealing to a broader base of voters. And I think that was the beginning of the slide that we now see him in Iowa and across the country.
That's a really interesting point because I've brought this up to you before. I've brought this up to other strategists that after the midterm election, I mean, he was touted as he's the future, the face of the GOP. He could be the next president. The New York Post had this cover of him and his family looking extra presidential, calling him the future. Do you think because he leaned in super hard to the culture wars issues, that's where maybe he lost that support? And do you see him not embracing them anytime soon? Because he was embracing bathroom policies, amongst others, on the debate stage last night.
Brittany, what are people really looking for? Are they looking for ideology, or are they looking for competent and courageous leadership at the top? I'd argue very strongly it's the latter. It's never really been about ideology, I believe, in this primary. It's about who can take us there. There being not just the White House, but they're back to a position of leadership, especially around the world. I think that is what people are looking for. And I don't think that's something that you get for being the poster child of the culture war. I think you get that by saying, I had a lot of difficult challenges in front of me. Here is how I met those challenges and overcame them, and here are the results of that. If people, there's a frustration in the country today that a lot of things aren't working, that nothing seems to be working right anymore. Show me somebody who can give you the confidence that they can make things work, make the trains run on time, as they say, and that person, I think, is well on their way to big things. And I don't think we've seen a lot of that, frankly, in the Republican primary. I don't think we've seen that a lot on either side of the fence in recent years, and people are hungry for it. Don't tell me you're a conservative and that's good enough. Tell me what you're going to do, and then also what you've already done. And DeSantis has done plenty. I think that's been drowned out a lot by his rush to become the ideological warrior.
Adam, we're heading into the holiday season, and we're also very close to Iowa, and that's when 2024 really, really kicks off. So what's on your radar? What are you looking out for within the next few weeks?
Well, everyone's going to be focused on Iowa. I'm more focused on New Hampshire. Iowa comes first, and it's a caucus and not a primary, as we know. And we'll have fun with that. But as I said earlier in this interview, if you look at the last three Republican winners in competitive caucuses, they've gone nowhere. And so I think it's more about what would Iowa do, Brittany, as a springboard or an influence on New Hampshire. New Hampshire, I do think, is significant. It's funny, very small state, not very diverse, and yet it has outsized influence on the process, I think, well beyond Iowa. And that, of course, leads right into Nevada, and shortly after that, South Carolina, where, again, unbelievably, Nikki Haley, as well as she's doing, is still 20 points or more behind the former president.
That brings an interesting point that I didn't think of. Do you think the candidates last night spent more time arguing with each other opposed to arguing about President Biden? Because something you didn't really hear too much on stage was that much about President Biden, and it was more about infighting. Do you think that's going to hurt them?
That's such a great observation. Absolutely. It doesn't help them, put it that way. Biden is the target ultimately for the Republican nominee. And you're right. You heard very little about that. Now, from the former president over the last couple weeks, you've heard almost nothing but that he's going square to square, toe to toe in the potential matchup with the former president. And you saw, of course, in recent polling, in the target states and swing states in America, right now, Trump has a lead over Joe Biden in every one of them, save for, I think it's Wisconsin, and that's like within the margin of error. So he is focused on the final prize. I think on the debate stage, they were all fighting that over a lesser prize, which is who amongst us stands tallest, but I don't think they're measuring high enough versus the former president to have put themselves squarely in a competitive position to take him on and perhaps defeat him among Republicans.
Adam, per usual, I love doing these post-debate recaps with you. It's always fun to break them down, provide insight, and just talk politics. Adam Goodman, thank you so much for joining me.
Always fun.